In this lecture, we're going to be speaking about pronoun errors, and more specifically, where it is that we often make errors. And a pronoun error is very often, or most often, an error of case, though sometimes it's an error of number, and we'll talk about that too. An error of case is something like what we see here, something that the Cookie Monster of the Sesame Street was often heard to say, "Me want cookie." So, of course, we understand that as being a mistake. And the reason it's a mistake is me is the first person objective pronoun, when as an object of a verb, it should be the subjective pronoun that we use. I want a cookie. Or to carry this transgression against pronouns even further, if someone said, "Him gave cookie to I," we'd recognize that as a mistake, or actually two mistakes. So, he gave a cookie to me would be the correct form. Anyway, so we'll be looking at items like this, and don't think that the mistakes that occur are as obvious as this, because they aren't. And very often where they occur, as I've talked about before, is they occur in more complicated constructions, and there's a pattern as to where we might see them. But anyway, as we go forward, I hope we can illuminate these issues, and so you learn not to make the mistakes and to use your pronouns correctly. One of the first areas that we see an error in pronoun usage is in the subjective, what should be the subjective position in a sentence, and where we have a compound pronoun in the subject. Okay, so compound means more than one. Okay, so very seldom would we hear something like "me want cookie," but we might hear something like "him and me got into it over the budget numbers." "Nancy and me stayed home last night." "Joe and me have been friends for 10 years. Okay, so now in each one of these, we see the usage of the objective pronoun, the pronoun that should represent the object, being used as the subject of the verb. So we are going to take a look at how we can recognize this and how we can correct it. Oh, and just note, this is not that extraordinary. Some time ago, I received a knock at my door, and I went to the door, and there was a fellow standing there who said he was running for the school board, and he was in opposition to some other school board member, and he said, to convince me that I should vote for him and not the other guy, he said, "Me and him's gotten into it lately." Okay, me and him. So my immediate thought was, me will never vote for you for a member of the school board. Okay, so anyway, it's quite common. It's quite common that we hear this. And also, the "Joe and me have been friends for 10 years, that type of formation is also something that we hear in speech, in colloquial speech. That is an everyday, relaxed speech. But it's not something that we can use in our formal writing. We have to get it correct. Anyway, so as we go forward, I'm going to be talking about how we can assure that we don't make this disastrous mistake in our writing. Something to remember is that the pronoun is always the same, whether it's by itself or with other pronouns or nouns. Okay, so, and this will lead to a very important rule and what's called a test to see if we're using the correct pronoun. So remember, if it's wrong by itself, it's wrong in combination with anything else. Okay, it doesn't change what we should start to recognize now as case if we have it in combination with other nouns or pronouns. Okay, so keep that in mind. We'll go forward and I'll introduce you to the drop test in regards to pronoun usage. The drop test is a wonderfully efficient and informal, not technical, way to test whether your form is correct. Okay, so and to see it, all you have to do is drop out parts of the sentence and isolate the item that you have in question. So, for instance, we have the sentence, "Nancy and me stayed home last night." Is that correct? or would it be Nancy and I stayed home last night? Okay, so maybe you know the answer, and if you do, just follow along because the general principle remains the same. Okay, so what you do is you drop out the complicating items. Okay, so we don't have any issue with Nancy, right? Nancy is correct no matter what. Nouns don't change, whether they're in the subjective or objective form. But pronouns do. So, and as we drop out Nancy, we can now compare the two sample sentences, me stayed home last night or I stayed home last night. So I hope that you'll hear now that the I stayed home last night is the correct form. And hence, it would be Nancy and I stayed home last night. Because remember the rule that I just stated above. The pronoun does not change from the compound to the isolated. Okay, so that is, if you have the pronoun in combination with something, it's the same as if it were isolated. So if it's I stayed home last night, it's Nancy and I stayed home last night. So I hope that's clear, and we'll continue to refer to the drop test as we go forward, because in many different instances, not just this, it's a wonderful tool. So here we have another example of the drop test, or another instance in which we can apply the drop test. So say we have the sample sentence, him and me argued over the budget numbers. So is that correct? Well, take a look at the sample sentences we have here in which we isolate the pronouns. Would we say him argued over the budget numbers or he argued over the budget numbers? And likewise, would we say me argued over the budget numbers or I argued over the budget numbers? Okay, so as you sort that out and you make your choices, we'll go forward to the next slide and we'll see which one is correct. Here we have the answer. Okay. I started myself. So in each case, we'll see that he argued over the budget numbers and I argued over the budget numbers is the usage that we should employ when we isolate the pronouns. And so remembering the rule that the pronouns do not ever change from an isolated usage, that is using it singly, to using it in combination with any other noun or pronoun, the correct form of the sentence would be he and I argued over the budget numbers. Okay, so I hope that you see from that the drop test is wonderfully useful, and as I said, we'll continue to refer back to it as we go forward. The second area of mistake that I'm going to address is confusion of the objective case. This is where the pronoun is being used in the place of the object of the verb, and sometimes where we would not make a mistake if the pronoun were being used by itself, we get confused if we use it in combination with other items. And so the example that I have here is after the presentation, the orientation counselors showed Rachel, Fernando, Tom, Lee, and I around the college. So is that correct? Well, again, using the drop test, we can isolate the pronoun and test it. So would you say the orientation counselors showed I around the college, or the orientation counselors showed me around the college? Well, I hope that you say they showed me around the college. They showed me around the college. And so, and if that's the case, well, whether it's the case or not, but it is the case that is correct. And so the complete sentence would be, they showed Rachel, Fernando, Tom, Lee, and me around the college. Again, using the drop test, which is wonderfully useful. But again, this is the second place where we have mistaken pronoun usage in some frequency. Here's another instance where we would use the objective form of the pronoun. We haven't talked about prepositions yet, but the preposition, those little words that give us location in reference to the box, in the box, to the box, under the box, words like this. They always take the objective case. Okay, they always take the objective pronoun. And we'll see that more clearly when we get to prepositions, but for right now, just go with that. And So we would have a sentence, perhaps, to Suzy, Fred, Hugh, Rush, and I, the movie was kind of lame. So the question is that correct? To Suzy, Fred, Hugh, Rush, and I, the movie was kind of lame. Well, again, using the drop test, would you say to I, the movie was lame, or to me, the movie was lame? Well, I hope that you'd say to me, the movie was lame. And that being the case, the correct form would be to Suzy, Fred, Hugh, Rush, and me, the movie was kind of lame. Okay, so again, it's in more complicated constructions that we sometimes make mistakes, that the mistakes tend to pop up. They don't pop up in isolation, so don't think that I'd never say something like to I. Well, very possibly not, but sometimes we get confused when the construction is a little bit more complicated, and we have to be a little bit more careful. But one of the ways to be careful is to employ the drop test, isolate the item in question, the pronoun in question, and then you can be more assured that you're using the correct form. The next two areas that cause us frequent trouble have to do with illogical shifts or inappropriate shifts. And what I mean by this is when we shift from, say, the first person to the second person. Remember, the whole discussion about the persons I, you, he, or we shift numbers. We change the number that we're referring to. Okay, so I'll just leave it there for a moment, and I'll go forward, and in the next slide, you'll start to understand what it is that I'm talking about, this shift. And as we see here, we should not be shifty. So the first shift that we want to avoid is the shift in person. This occurs when the writer shifts person, also called a point of view. Say, for instance, from in our first example, from the first person to the second person. So when I went to high school, the only language that you could take was Spanish. So can you start to see how that's illogical? When I went to high school, the only language that you could take was Spanish. That doesn't quite work. Now, one of the reasons that we have this issue, that we have this problem, is in colloquial language, that is how we speak every day, and believe me, your professor does the same thing. We use you, the word you, to indicate the general case, the general person. Okay, so if I said something like, you have to be careful crossing that street because, there's a lot of crazy drivers out there. You could get killed. Well, I'm not necessarily talking about you. I'm talking about people in general. You have no intention of going anywhere near that street, and I know that. But I'm just saying, in general, a person has to be careful crossing that street. You see, so we use you not to mean you specifically, but to mean the general case. But in writing, you can't do that. In formal writing, you can't do that. So when I went to high school, the only foreign language that you could take was Spanish. Is a shift in person from the first person to the second person. We see another example here. When a person is driving, it's dangerous for you to be texting on your cell phone. You see, well, but maybe you're 20 miles away. So what do you mean it's dangerous for me when there's always somebody driving? So I'm not sure what it is that you're talking about. You see, but in the same reason, I went from the third person, a person, okay, to you, second person. Okay, and it's an illogical shift, and so we cannot have that. One of the hallmarks of good writing is that we stay consistent. So if you're speaking in the first person, you stay in the first person, or if you're speaking in the third person, you stay in the third person. So when I went to high school, the only foreign language that I could take was Spanish. Okay, or the only language that was offered was Spanish, something like that. When a person is driving, he or she should not text on their cell phone, or to follow the sentence, it's dangerous for him or her to be texting on the cell phone. Okay, so you want to stay in the same person, and we'll go forward and we'll take a look at a couple more examples of this. A couple other examples of mistaken construction. In the first instance, very often people first starting college don't realize how hard you have to work to keep your grades up. Okay, so now notice people is third person plural, and you is second person, either singular or plural. And so we have a shift there. We have this illogical shift. They're starting college. I'm not. So why do I have to work hard? Okay. So anyway, also when an athlete wins the gold medal, you always feel a sense of accomplishment. Well, that's his medal. He won it. I mean, I don't feel a sense of accomplishment. I might enjoy watching his performance or her performance, but I don't feel a sense of accomplishment. So you see, we have this illogical shift, and in each case, you should stay consistent. So when an athlete wins the gold medal, he or she always feels a sense of accomplishment. Or in the first instance, very often people first starting college don't realize how hard they have to work to keep their grades up. Okay, so a couple other instances where we have this illogical shift in person. Another area of frequent mistakes is in that of a shift in number, and that is when we mean to be referring to an individual, a singular entity, and we shift to the plural. Okay, so we're shifting from the singular to the plural, but not for a logical reason. It's not as if we're speaking about one person here and then we want to reference a group of people. We're actually speaking about the same individual, but for some reason we shift to the plural form in referring to that one person. So in the next couple slides, we'll see how it is that these mistakes develop and what we can do to guard against them. So here we see a couple of incorrect usages of the pronoun involving a shift in number. So take a look at these sentences and see if you can figure out, before I explain, why they're incorrect. So the first one is, if anyone wants pizza, they should bring their plate up to the table. Okay? That's example number one. Everyone should pick up their books and go home. Okay, so what's wrong with those? Well, the clue is in the what's called the indefinite pronoun, the anyone or the everyone. How many is involved in anyone? Hint, one. Okay, anyone or everyone. That's singular. But how many is they? Well, they is the plural pronoun. So they should bring their plate up to the table. That's the plural subjective pronoun and the plural possessive pronoun, third person. And the same in the second example as well. So these are shifts in number. We're shifting from the first person to the third person plural. That's incorrect. Now, I'll explain what we should be using here, but first let me touch on why this mistake is often made in writing, because it is allowed in speech. In fact, it's an ancient usage. It exists in literature going back hundreds of years, and but present day, it's not allowed. So the grammar books tell us we can't do it. And believe me, I wish that we could, because it would make my life a whole lot simpler. I wouldn't have to talk about it this much. But it's proper to use in day-to-day speech. The grammar police are not going to come out and arrest you if you do this, but you must not use it in your formal writing, and it being shift in number. So anyway, so I'll go forward and we'll take a look at the usage that we should employ. First, remember that indefinite pronouns are usually singular. So everyone, anyone, everybody, anybody, these are singular, and the hint is that the word includes one, right? It's just one. That's singular. That's just one. It's not two. It's not every two. It's not every three. It's one. Okay, so enough of that. I get excited. And even when the one is not explicitly stated, so if you have a word like each or every, as in every member of the ball club or each employee, these are always one. These are always singular. Okay, so that's a general rule to remember, and it becomes important as we go forward and take a look at this particular construction and the error that evolves from the misuse of the singular indefinite pronoun. a couple of examples here of the correct usage of the singular and avoiding the shift in number. That often evolves from using the indefinite singular pronoun. So take a look at the first instance that I've marked incorrect. Somebody left their keys on the table. Now, you'd say that. I mean, I'd say it. Somebody left their keys on the table. They're not getting home tonight. So very possible to say. But it's not correct in writing. So there's a distinction between what's correct in writing and what's correct in speech. And in writing, you should say somebody left his or her keys on the table. And there's a reason for the his or her that we'll get to later. But for right now, you want to just remember to stay gender neutral. And you don't know if it's a man or woman, boy or girl, who left keys on the table, so you say his or her. Another example, anyone who expects service here should have their head examined. Well, we should know by now that that is incorrect. Any one is how many? Hint, one, okay, any one. And how many heads does a singular individual have? Well, as far as I've been able to tell in my many years on this planet, each person has only one head. Okay, so anyone who expects service here should have his or her head examined. Okay, got that? Okay, so avoid the shift in number. Remain consistent in your application of numbers. Okay, in your application of the consistent pronoun usage in your sentences. There's one other way to avoid the singular plural shift. As we were talking about earlier, the first way is to go all singular. Okay, go single. The other way is to go all plural if you think that's appropriate. So a couple of examples. All the people who expect service here should have their heads examined. So notice that we shift everything to the plural. People, their heads. Or all taxpayers should pay their taxes on time. Okay, taxpayers plural, their plural. Students plural should pick up their books and go out the same door they came in and treat themselves to an early night. Okay, treat themselves plural, they plural, their books plural, students plural. Okay, so again, it's consistency that's key here. So either all singular or all plural, but don't mix or match. The last thing that I'll talk about in this lecture about pronoun usage will be what's called ambiguous reference. So if you don't know what the word ambiguous means, it means something is not clear. It could have two meanings, or it can have many meanings. It's ambiguous. It can't be seen clearly. Sports fans, it comes from the same word that ambidextrous comes from, and so you might know that ambidextrous refers to somebody who can throw with both hands. Well, ambiguous reference could mean a meaning that could be on the one hand or on the other hand. So it's ambiguous. Anyway, so it's not clear. So, but what it means is that we're not sure who you're talking about. So take a look at the example over here, and you'll see how confused you would be if somebody actually talked like this. And I've known people who talk like this. They just launch in and they say something like, so I was talking to her, and she told me that he said they were going to do the thing over there, but all the time I was thinking about how he had told me it was going to happen here, just like she had promised. You see, so who? I mean, wait a second, slow down. Who's he? Who's she? I mean, the only pronoun references I really understood were here and I. I mean, everything else is ambiguous. Okay, so that's what we mean by ambiguous reference. And there's a few cases and places where it occurs frequently, and I'm going to cover those in the next few slides. Here we have a couple of examples. We're down here, I think, okay, that illustrate some of the confusion that arises with what's called ambiguous reference. So one of the examples that we have is Tom told Jerry that he got an A on the test. Now, I sometimes ask students, who is he? And they insist that, oh, it's very clear to them, it's Tom. Or some say it's Jerry, and fisticuffs ensue because they're very sure. But the fact is, you're not sure, because he can refer to anyone, as the arrows attest. The he could point to either Tom or Jerry. Another example is when the policeman pulled Dave over, he was angry. Again, who was angry? Is he referring to the policeman, or is he referring to Dave? Okay, so in cases like this, where you have a single pronoun that could refer to two or more antecedents, and we remember what the word antecedent means. It refers to the word that comes before the word the pronoun should be pointing at unambiguously, that is, very clearly. Well, when you have two or more possible antecedents, you have ambiguity. You have lack of clarity. That has to be cleared up. In the next slide, I'll show you a couple different ways that these sentences could be solved, or the ambiguity in these sentences could be solved, and hopefully that'll provide you a model as you go forward in your writing. Here we have a couple of examples down below now, how these sentences, or the previous sentences, could be rewritten for clarity. One thing to note is that when a possible correction is offered, keep in mind that there's probably many different possible right ways to write a sentence. And for reasons of space and time, we can't go into all of them, but there are more than one possible ways. Anyway, so here's a couple different ways. In the Tom and Jerry sentence, you could make a direct quote out of it. Tom told Jerry, quote, I got an A on the test. Okay, you could, unquote, of course, you could write the sentence like that. In the angry policeman, or angry Dave sentence, you could write, Dave was angry when the policeman pulled him over. You see, so you've named Dave as the one being angry, and him has to refer to Dave, because it can't be that the policeman is pulling himself over. Okay, I mean, policemen don't go around pulling themselves over, pull over there, I'm driving too fast, I'm going to give me a ticket. No, that doesn't happen. Okay, anyway, so Dave was angry when the policeman pulled him over. You see, so we shift the sentence around a little bit, and we eliminate the ambiguity. Another kind of ambiguous reference, which is perhaps more common than the he, she, it, they example above, is just simply somebody refers to an ambiguous they, an unclear they. The streets are full of potholes. They should fix them. Well, who do you mean they? Who do you have in mind as fixing them? Now, I know that we talk like this, and very often in casual everyday speech we can get away with such lack of clarity, but you can't really write like that. You say they should fix them. Do you mean the city? Do you mean the county? Do you mean the Department of Transportation? Do you mean the country? I mean, what? Who do you mean by they? Or they should make movies that we can take our kids to. Okay, again, who's they? Directors, producers, Hollywood studios, or studios outside of Hollywood, Bollywood studios, studios in London. Who is they? Who exactly do you mean by they? Anyway, so be careful when using this ambiguous reference to the mysterious they, because it's not clear. And again, you can get away with it in speech. Nobody calls you to account, but in writing, they do. So you have to be careful. So that's it for pronouns, at least for this lecture. There's one more short lecture in which I'll pick up some tag-ins and some what the Brits call one-offs. And then we'll be finished with this whole series, and this went on much longer than you thought it would. You didn't know these little tiny words could be so complicated, open up such a world of information and confusion, and have so many possibilities for getting them wrong. Anyway, but I hope that now we've learned many of the ways to protect ourselves from making these errors. So again, refer to the text, do the check your knowledge exercise, post questions in the chat room, and I'll see you next time.